It was just after dawn, on a cold morning in early 1941, when the battlefield near a shattered French farm lay silent, under a thin veil of smoke drifting from the night's shelling. Frost clung to the edges of collapsed stone walls, and the muddy trenches glistened with the pale light creeping over the horizon. A lone anti-tank crew, exhausted from days of retreat, crouched beside their worn-out gun, listening to the distant rumble of engines growing steadily louder. The sound was unmistakable. German Panzers were advancing again, their tracks grinding through the frozen earth with a confidence born from weeks of victories across the region. The gunner wiped grime from his sight, steadied his breathing, and tried to ignore the weight of knowing their position was exposed and their ammunition dangerously low. Then he saw the first tank's silhouette emerging through the smoke, followed by two more spaced in a tight formation. With one last look at the trench wall in front of him, he prepared for a shot that was never meant to be taken, yet would be remembered for its impossible outcome, setting the stage for everything that followed. The months following the collapse of France in June 1940 reshaped the entire military landscape of Western Europe. German armored doctrine, refined during the rapid blitz across the Low Countries, had proven overwhelmingly effective. Panzer divisions moved with speed, precision, and tight coordination between tanks, infantry, and air support. Their success created a sense of inevitability on every front where German armor appeared. By early 1941, scattered Allied units, whether remnants of French forces, attached British detachments, or local resistance-supported groups, struggled to resist armored pushes that combined mobility with disciplined firepower. The battlefields that remained active were defined by broken terrain, hastily dug positions, and improvised defensive lines formed from whatever equipment had survived the previous year's chaos. Anti-tank weaponry lagged behind the demands of the moment. Many crews still operated older 25mm or 37mm guns that were effective only under ideal conditions, short ranges, clear angles, and stable firing grounds. Against Panzer III and Panzer IV models, which now appeared with improved armor layouts and more confident crews, these weapons felt increasingly inadequate. Reports circulated across various Allied commands describing shells bouncing off angled front plates or failing to penetrate side armor unless striking at near-perfect perpendicular angles. Crews learned quickly that their survival depended not only on training, but also on intuition, terrain exploitation, and sometimes pure chance. Many defensive manuals updated in haste encouraged low firing positions, ambush tactics, and the use of trenches or natural depressions to catch tank bellies where armor was thinnest. The region where the Ricochet incident occurred was typical of early 1941's defensive reality. A patchwork of farmhouses, ditches, and abandoned orchards formed a rough line that soldiers used as a makeshift barrier. Trenches were carved quickly, often at night, and reinforced with timber salvaged from collapsed barns. Heavy rains earlier in the season had turned much of the soil into a thick mixture of mud and broken earth, making movement slow and exhausting. Yet these same conditions created pockets of cover, sunken paths, eroded trenches, and angled walls left from demolished structures that provided rare opportunities for defensive gunners to attempt unconventional shots. Some manuals mentioned deflection angles or bank shots only in theoretical contexts, acknowledging that in real combat, such attempts were nearly impossible to execute deliberately. The gun crew involved had been operating with minimal rest, rotating between fallback positions as German pressure mounted along the sector. Air anti-tank gun, though reliable, had suffered from multiple relocations and exposure to the elements. The barrel showed signs of wear, and the sight required frequent adjustment. Ammunition was scarce, forcing the crew to rely on discipline and calculation rather than sustained fire. Their orders were clear: delay the panzer advance long enough for the rest of the line to reposition. It was an objective that, given the strength of their equipment, relied heavily on terrain familiarity and the resilience of the soldiers manning the gun. German armored units, meanwhile, approached the area with confidence. The panzer crews advancing toward the farm complex had spent months refining maneuver tactics learned from earlier campaigns. Their formation spacing, communication drills, and coordinated reconnaissance gave them a strong advantage against defenders with limited resources. The terrain ahead appeared accessible, with only a handful of visible defensive points. These crews had faced sporadic resistance for days, and most obstacles had been cleared with systematic fire and movement. They expected little more than temporary resistance at the next line. Yet beneath the surface, tension among the defenders grew. Every man knew the sound of German engines creeping closer meant another test of resolve. Anti-tank crews, more than most, carried the weight of this pressure. They were often the first targeted and the least protected. When tanks broke through unsuppressed anti-tank positions, the entire defensive sector usually collapsed. This understanding gave every shot enormous significance. In the muddy, smoke-filled stretch near the farm, the gunner surveyed the trench configuration in front of him, recognizing the narrow angles and unpredictable surfaces that shaped his firing options. The distance to the approaching panzers was closing quickly, and the available line of sight left him with limited choices. The atmosphere, shaped by exhaustion, cold ground, and an advancing enemy armored formation, created the circumstances for the shot that would soon redefine what was thought possible with a single shell. And as those engines grew louder, the pressures shaping the battlefield narrowed toward one moment that would demand more than standard tactics or textbook firing solutions. As the German armored column approached the battered farm region, the landscape revealed the scars of repeated clashes. Craters, burned-out vehicles, shattered equipment, and collapsed stone structures made the terrain unpredictable, but also tactically interesting. Trenches cut through the soft earth in broken lines, some reinforced by lumber, others barely holding their shape after nights of rain. The defenders had learned to see opportunity in this destruction. Any depression in the ground, any slanted wall, any exposed tree root could alter the path of a shell. Such terrain rarely offered perfect firing lanes, but it frequently created narrow, jagged angles that forced gunners to adapt. It was in these uneven earthworks that the crew prepared for the next wave of armor. The gun position itself was not ideal. It sat slightly recessed behind a mound of collapsed rubble, providing limited frontal cover but restricting elevation and traverse. The trench ahead curved sharply to the right, before dipping into a deeper section where previous blasts had torn the soil open. This uneven trench provided concealment, but also created a blind angle directly between the gun and the approaching tanks. Under normal conditions, gunners avoided indirect angles because inconsistent surfaces introduced too many variables. But with the German formation advancing in a straight, confident line, the defenders had no alternative but to rely on improvisation. Each man understood this terrain intimately after days of fighting, and the gunner in particular knew the jagged trench wall in front of him could play a critical role if the situation became desperate. German reconnaissance had already mapped sections of the defensive layout, but the speed of their advance meant details were often outdated. The panzer crews assumed the terrain ahead was similar to what they had encountered just kilometers earlier: light resistance, isolated anti-tank guns, and defenders willing to retreat rather than hold ground. Their formation reflected this confidence, the lead tank sweeping forward to test the line, the second maintaining a tight supporting distance, and the third positioned to exploit any breakthrough. These tactics minimized delays and reinforced crew morale. The assumption was consistent with the broader German belief that Allied anti-tank defenses lacked both firepower and coordination. On the defenders' side, fatigue had become a constant companion. Every man had witnessed tanks surviving direct hits from their weapons. Shells that theoretically should have penetrated often shattered, embedded uselessly, or bounced off armor plates shaped to deflect incoming fire. Reports from other sectors described tank engagements lasting far longer than expected, with crews forced to wait for close-range opportunities that carried immense risk. These stories weighed heavily on the gunner's mind. Experience had taught him that a conventional shot, taken too early or at an imperfect angle, would accomplish nothing except drawing enemy fire. Yet holding fire too long risked allowing the Panzers to close the distance and overrun the position. The trench system, though damaged, still provided partial cover. Communication between nearby defenders relied on short gestures and urgent whispers. Everyone was aware that the anti-tank gun represented their strongest means of stopping the tanks, rifle and machis. Nagan fire had little effect on German armor except to distract or briefly obscure vision. If the gun failed, the entire position would likely collapse, forcing yet another retreat through terrain that became more difficult to defend the farther they fell back. This growing sense of necessity sharpened attention and steadied nerves despite exhaustion. The gunner braced himself as the Panzers drew closer. He examined the trench wall carefully, calculating distances and angles. He noticed how the frozen surface, hardened overnight, created a firmer boundary than the muddy sections beyond it. He recognized how the wall's slight inward slope could redirect force upward if struck at a precise angle. None of this was guaranteed to work, nor did any training manual encourage depending on such physics in the chaos of battle. But the gunner had learned that survival sometimes demanded actions that existed outside conventional doctrine. When the first Panzer finally emerged from the smoke in a clear silhouette, its front armor deflecting the weak morning light, the defenders tightened their grip on their weapons. The second tank followed closely, its turrets scanning the trenches for movement. The third remained slightly farther back, maintaining formation discipline. Together, they represented a threat the defenders had seen far too many times in recent months, armored strength moving with purpose against an exhausted line running short on time, cover, and ammunition. And within this tense space, where terrain, exhaustion, doctrine, and necessity collided, the stage was set for a moment that would soon unfold with extraordinary precision. The gunner steadied his aim, fully aware that the next action would either halt the advance or seal their fate, guiding the narrative forward toward the many angles from which this event can be understood. The gunner at the center of this event was not a newcomer to the battlefield. He had spent months learning to judge distances by instinct, to correct for wind without thinking, and to recognize the sound of approaching armor long before it appeared. Fatigue weighed heavily on him, but it had sharpened rather than dulled his awareness. He understood that a single mistake could bring the tanks directly over their position, leaving no chance for escape. His crew depended on his judgment, and he carried that responsibility quietly. The cold air stung his face, his gloves were stiff from frozen mud, and every movement required deliberate effort. Yet his mind remained clear. He knew that their ammunition shortage meant each shot had to count. This pressure created a mental space where fear and focus intertwined, forming the intense concentration needed for what he was about to attempt. His decision to rely on the trench wall was not driven by confidence, but by necessity. shaped by experience and the instinct to survive. The battlefield's tactical reality forced the gun crew into a difficult position. Conventional firing lanes were broken by debris, collapsed structures, and smoke drifting unpredictably across the ground. Direct shots at the Panzers were nearly impossible without exposing the gun to immediate return fire. The trench wall ahead, though uneven and risky, offered a narrow opportunity, a potential deflection toward the underside of the leading tank. Anti-tank crews knew that a tank's belly armor was significantly thinner than its frontal plating, but accessing that weakness usually required waiting for the tank to crest a ridge or pass over a concealed pit. In this case, the terrain offered only an angled surface inside the trench, hardened by overnight frost. The gunner recognized this rare configuration and understood how a shell might skip upward if struck correctly. It was a dangerous tactic, one that relied on precision, timing, and a bit of unpredictability. But as the Panzers advanced in a straight, steady formation, it became clear that improvisation, rather than instruction, would determine whether the defenders could halt the armor before it reached their position. The anti-tank shell used that morning was a standard armor-piercing round, designed for direct penetration rather than complex ricochets. Its weight, velocity, and composition made it capable of defeating light to medium German armor at short range. But against the reinforced belly and side plating of a Panzer III or IV, the odds were slim. Yet, the combination of barrel elevation, distance, and the angled trench wall introduced an unexpected variable. Physics played its part. When the shell struck the hardened, sloped wall, kinetic energy transferred along a new trajectory, rising with enough force to hit the first tank beneath its turret. Engineers and ballistic experts later analyzed similar incidents and concluded that the angle of impact, the firmness of the surface, and even minor imperfections in the shell itself could produce such a rare outcome. This was not an error. It was a precise, almost accidental alignment of man, machine, and environment. From the perspective of the Panzer crews, the morning seemed routine. Their formation, practiced and disciplined, had encountered minor resistance before, and they expected this line of trenches to be just another delay. The lead tank, armored and confident, moved over what appeared to be ordinary terrain. The crews inside monitored their instruments, checked the horizon for infantry, and kept their machine guns ready to suppress any hidden defenders. They could not anticipate that the uneven trench wall ahead, combined with a skilled gunner's calculation, would redirect a shell directly into the first vehicle's vulnerable belly. The reaction was immediate. Internal explosions, smoke, and fire caused confusion. The following tanks, close-in formation, were caught in the unexpected chain reaction. Discipline momentarily faltered as crews attempted emergency maneuvers, highlighting how even well-trained soldiers could be disrupted by a single, unforeseen moment. The human and mechanical coordination that had carried the Panzers across Europe suddenly encountered the limits imposed by terrain, chance, and a single well-aimed shot. The convergence of these human, tactical, technological, and enemy factors set the stage for the decisive moment. Every variable, fatigue, terrain, shell design, and enemy expectation aligned to produce an extraordinary outcome, preparing the battlefield for the climax that would follow. The lead Panzer emerged fully from the smoke, its metal hull gleaming faintly in the cold morning light. Its tracks ground the frozen earth as the engine's low rumble filled the trench line. The gunner steadied his shoulder against the recoil brace, fingers tightening around the trigger. His breath came in slow, controlled exhalations, fog curling in front of his face. Every second felt elongated, yet the tanks moved closer with terrifying speed. The trench wall ahead loomed as both an obstacle and an opportunity. and he focused entirely on the angle where the shell might strike and ricochet upward. There was no time to hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. The gun barked, sending a single shell hurtling toward the sloped surface. For a fraction of a second, all seemed normal. The projectile arcing toward the trench wall with deadly intent. Then, in an almost imperceptible motion, the shell struck the hard, angled surface and changed direction. It rose, following a trajectory that defied expectation, striking the belly of the lead Panzer. Flames erupted inside the tank as the armor buckled under the unexpected impact. The crew inside scrambled, the noise of metal twisting and in tow, internal explosions echoing across the farmyard. The second Panzer, moving just behind the first, did not escape the blast. Shrapnel and fragments from the first tank tore through its lightly armored sections, igniting fuel lines and disabling tracks. Smoke poured from the engine compartment as the crew fought to regain control. The third tank, slightly farther back, slowed abruptly, caught in the debris and chaos. What had begun as a straightforward German advance dissolved into confusion and panic, all triggered by one calculated, desperate shot. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Defenders peeked over trenches, wary but alert, seeing smoke and fire consume the enemy formation. The gunner's heart raced, yet his eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, knowing the rare physics of the Ricochet had just rewritten the tactical reality. One moment had changed everything. The advancing armor now vulnerable, the psychological momentum shifting, and the stage set for immediate action that would determine the rest of the encounter. The Ricochet's aftermath unfolded in rapid, chaotic succession. The first Panzer, immobilized and burning, became a focal point of destruction. Flames licked through the interior, and the crew, trapped under twisted metal, struggled to escape. The second tank, crippled by secondary damage, spun on the frozen earth, smoke curling from ruptured fuel lines and shattered hatches. Its movement, once controlled and disciplined, became erratic, forcing the third Panzer to brake sharply and shift formation. German training could not have prepared them for such simultaneous setbacks. The chain reaction was devastating in its immediacy. Soldiers in nearby trenches held their positions, eyes wide, measuring the unexpected turn of events. For the gunner, there was no time for celebration. The remaining armored units hesitated, scanning for hidden defenses, uncertain of the unseen threats now disrupting their advance. Every second of hesitation compounded the effect of the initial ricochet. Explosions echoed across the shattered farm, metal groaning and smoke drifting in thick, dark clouds. The psychological impact on the German crews was clear. Surprise and fear, even among experienced tank operators, could fracture coordination instantly. The gunner's calculation had altered not only physical outcomes, but also the momentum of the battle. He adjusted his position slightly, preparing for any further movement from enemy armor, though most of it had already been neutralized by a combination of direct impact and collateral fragmentation. Reinforcements from the opposing side cautiously moved forward, taking advantage of the momentary disarray. Every gesture, every cautious maneuver now carried weight. This single moment, a shell striking a sloped trench wall, ricocheting upward and destroying 3 tanks, illustrated the unpredictability of war. The German advance, once methodical and assured, had been interrupted. Terrain, physics, and human decision intersected to produce an outcome both rare and decisive. The battlefield, momentarily transformed, awaited the consequences that would ripple through strategy, morale, and the course of the engagement. From this pivotal point, the aftermath was inevitable, and the scale of destruction became clear. The immediate consequences of the ricochet shot were visible across the shattered farm. The lead panzer lay smoldering, its twisted metal frame emitting smoke and flames that could be seen for hundreds of meters. The second tank, crippled and motionless, had suffered fires in the engine compartment and ruptured tracks, while the third remained stalled, surrounded by debris from its companions. German infantry and support units approached cautiously, wary of hidden defenders and unexpected explosives. Commanders quickly realized that the formation had been broken, forcing a temporary halt in their advance. Radio communications buzzed with confusion as tank crews reported damage, casualties, and immobilized vehicles, an unusual state for units accustomed to swift, overwhelming progress. For the defenders, the moment brought a mixture of relief and continued vigilance. Soldiers cautiously emerged from trenches, scanning the wreckage, assessing the extent of destruction, and preparing for any follow-up attack. The gunner, though exhausted, maintained focus. He observed the German crews struggling to regroup, noting that panic and disorder now hampered what had been an organized assault just moments before. Nearby units moved forward, taking advantage of the chaos to reinforce positions, repair defensive lines, and resupply weapons where possible. Small arms fire and machine gun cover helped secure the perimeter, allowing anti-tank crews to prepare for any additional armored approach. Reports filed later in unit logs described the incident as extraordinary. Officers recorded that one single shot had effectively neutralized 3 tanks, highlighting both the rarity and significance of the action. Witness statements emphasized the combination of skill, situational awareness, and terrain exploitation that made it possible. Soldiers on both sides remarked on the psychological impact. German confidence shaken, Allied morale momentarily elevated, and the battlefield dynamics altered. In terms of immediate tactical outcomes, the gunners' action delayed the enemy advance, inflicted significant material losses, and provided breathing space for retreating or regrouping units. This moment marked the beginning of a turning point on that sector of the front, illustrating how a single, expertly executed act could reshape the immediate battlefield and redefine the tactical possibilities of anti-tank warfare. The operational consequences of the ricochet shot extended beyond the immediate battlefield. German command, upon reviewing reports from the engagement, noted the unusual loss of 3 tanks from a single anti-tank shell. While rare, such incidents underscored vulnerabilities in armored advances when terrain and ingenuity intersected. Orders for subsequent operations included cautionary guidance on advancing through areas with uneven ground or improvised defenses. Tank crews were reminded of the risks posed by concealed anti-tank positions, even in seemingly open fields, reflecting a subtle but significant shift in tactical awareness. For the Allied defenders, the event became a symbol of resilience. Unit reports emphasized how skill, observation, and rapid adaptation could compensate for inferior numbers and equipment. The gunner's shot inspired other crews to reconsider the value of indirect firing angles, trench positioning, and exploiting terrain to counter armored superiority. While manuals and doctrine rarely mentioned such tactics, soldiers on the ground began to experiment cautiously, documenting the physics of deflection and ricochet in operational logs. Military historians later cited this incident as an example of how small units, acting with ingenuity, could influence larger operational outcomes. Casualty reports confirmed that all 3 panzer crews suffered injuries, with several fatalities in the lead vehicle. German losses were compounded by the temporary immobilization of remaining armor, forcing a slower, more cautious advance across that sector. The psychological effect lingered. Tank crews, previously confident in the invincibility of their machines, faced the unsettling reality that terrain and human ingenuity could decisively alter engagements. For the gunner and his crew, the event brought recognition, though survival remained paramount. They continued their defensive duties, aware that every engagement could demand similar precision under pressure. This incident became a documented case study in battlefield improvisation, illustrating how the convergence of human skill, tactical awareness, and technological factors could produce outcomes far beyond expectation. The immediate victory was tangible, but its lessons would influence both soldiers and commanders in understanding the unpredictable nature of war, setting the stage for broader reflection on ingenuity and courage under fire. Moments like this remind us that war is shaped not only by numbers or technology, but by human judgment, ingenuity, and courage under pressure. One gunner, faced with exhaustion, limited resources, and an advancing armored force, made a decision that defied conventional tactics. His choice to use the trench wall as a deflecting surface illustrates the delicate interplay between skill, observation, and the environment. In the chaos of battle, small decisions can ripple outward, producing effects far larger than anyone might anticipate. The destruction of 3 panzers with a single shell became a testament to that principle, a rare convergence of physics, timing, and human focus. The event also challenges assumptions about predictability in warfare. Armored doctrine, experience, and confidence are vital, yet they can be disrupted by seemingly improbable circumstances. Terrain, fatigue, and improvisation introduced variables that formal training cannot always anticipate. For the defenders, the Ricochet shot offered a fleeting but critical window of advantage, altering both the physical and psychological landscape of the battlefield. For the attackers, it became a cautionary lesson in humility, demonstrating that even the most disciplined and well-equipped forces are vulnerable to creative and unexpected actions. Ultimately, this incident exemplifies how individual agency can influence the broader course of war. It is a reminder that history is composed not only of sweeping campaigns and grand strategies, but also of singular, human moments, instances where a single choice, executed with precision and courage, reshapes the outcome of events. In reflecting on that morning near the shattered farm, we see the extraordinary power of determination, skill, and the human capacity to seize opportunity amid chaos, leaving a lasting imprint on the story of conflict.